Cues from the creators of Conversational Christianity. We're going to be in John 4 again, and probably one more time next week. This is just an amazing exchange between Jesus and the woman at the well, and there's so much that could be said. There's entire books that are written on this particular conversation, but I'm going to draw at least 3, probably 4 conversational cues that we can take from our Lord as far as what we need to be doing when talking to our neighbors and friends and things of that nature. In John chapter 4, again, not to review too much, but Jesus is on a journey. He has gone through Samaria because he wants to talk to this woman, and it's going to result in most of the town coming out and believing on him. But as he pauses near a well, he's tired. His disciples go on into town to get something to eat. This woman shows up. He strikes up a conversation with her over the most simplest of things, such as, I'm thirsty, can I get something to drink? And from there, he steers the conversation into a life-changing moment. And I think that is significant for you and I to reference with regards to what we need to be doing. Even if we're not living in the last of the last days, and I believe we are, but even if that's not the case, let's say the world's going to go on for another 2,000 years and many other things are going to transpire. The fact of the matter is you are living in the last of the last days for somebody, perhaps yourself, your family member, whatever it may be. And we need to take full advantage of every opportunity we can to make sure that we draw them to the Lord. And so when you see this conversation happening between Jesus and the woman at the well, you can begin to make a lot of applications that are necessary for us to make. Thus far, we've noticed that Jesus was aware of his situation, the context. He was aware of the woman, the need that she had. Number 2, we saw that he initiates the conversation by asking her, "Would you help me with a drink of water?" Today, the key word is going to be hope. Hope. That in the course of our conversations, we need to make sure that we center on hope. There's absolutely enough bad news in the world. You don't really need to dredge up or to spend much time thinking about what you could talk about with regards to bad news. You can go off into 1,000 different realms with regards to bad news. Everybody can major in that one. The person who can major in hope, however, the person who can really talk about that which is positive and yet to come, that individual is special and unique and will draw others to them. Hope. As you see in this passage, going beyond what we've seen so far, I want you to notice, come back to, verse 16. Jesus says to her, "Go call your husband, come here." Woman answers, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "Right in saying that you have no husband, for you've had 5, and the one you now have is not your husband. What you have said is true." The woman picks up on that little piece of information. And again, we don't have the entire conversation probably. And so all of the exchange is not written down for us by John, I suspect. But we do have enough for us to get the picture as to what's taking place. And what John does through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit is he zeroes in on this idea of Jesus being able to say to her, "I recognize that you are living with a man. You've had 5 husbands." Jesus would have had no way of knowing that had he not been somebody who miraculously was given that information. She then concludes, you got to be a prophet. I suspect that what John is trying to set us up for with regards to that little line is that you and I need to recognize that she recognizes him, Jesus, as being credible. He's got a witness that is very important. You and I can't do that. That's one of the cues that we cannot emulate. I can't predict. I don't have the prophetic ability to know things about people that I've never experienced or learned about their life. So I can't do that. But I can establish my credibility before going much further into the conversation. And I think that's the overall application there. However you want to go about it, discussing this idea of the prophet, Jesus being a prophet, it seems that what she is acknowledging here is that you've got information that you shouldn't have, or that is not typical. And even within that, there is a level of hopefulness that I'm going to discover something in this conversation that I maybe haven't thought about before, dealt with, dwelt upon, whatever it may be. If you and I can do that same thing when we sit beside somebody in the doctor's office, waiting on our appointment, if we pass them in Walmart and we get to strike up a conversation, whatever it may be, if you and I can be known for folks who are hope-filled rather than gripe-filled, those individuals who pass us again are likely to be drawn back into the conversation rather than to avoid us. You know it's true. There are certain people, and I'm not asking you to put names to it, but you know it's true. There are certain people you avoid because they are constantly talking about the negative. They're cynics. They have nothing good to say. Every day's a bad day. They want to whine about this. They want to whine about that. And generally speaking, you try to avoid that person. You can't do that if you want to be of Christ. If you want to be of the Lord, if you want to follow his cues. People need to look at you and assume something good's going to come from this exchange. Now, it may not always be warm and fuzzy, but I know that in my exchange with that person, I might learn something. I'll be challenged to be better. I'll be whatever it may be. There needs to be a positive hope that something from this conversation is going to be lasting and taken off into the future in a positive way for me. Don't be that other person. I saw just this past week, I was passing a vehicle, and I'm not going to be too detailed, but it kind of shows you the way I think a lot of Christians operate in this world. There were two signs in their back window, you know those decals that you can put in your back window, both of them pretty prominent. On the left-hand side was a statement that says, "My mom is an angel in heaven." And I think it even had a little picture of an angel or something, but that was the statement. "My mom is now an angel in heaven." On the right was a rather offensive statement that employed the word for a female dog. And so you've got on the left, "My mother is an angel in heaven," and on the right, this curse word, right there glaring, side by side, and I couldn't help but think, that's often the way we are as Christians. Now, you may not employ that word, God willing that you don't, but the fact of the matter is that if you are somebody, I've used this illustration before, if you're somebody who has sat through worship service this morning, only to go to the local restaurant here in just about 30 minutes and gripe at the waiter or the waitress and leave a lousy tip and act like a non-Christian after coming away from church service, you're just like that person who was driving that vehicle. Your testimony is completely messed up. And James would say, how is it possible for a well, a spring, to give both bitter and sweet water at the same time? And yet we as Christians, so often it seems like we're that person. We spend an hour in church to spend an hour in the restaurant doing exactly what we did, exactly the opposite of what we did in church. Jesus wants us to be people who emulate hope. Now, hope is not always warm and fuzzy, but hope is always something that draws you to a better conclusion. Now, let me show you this passage. I got 3 real quick points that I think you'll see rather easily with regards to what Jesus does here. So she calls him a prophet in verse 19. And then I want you to notice what happens in verses 20 and following. "Our fathers worshiped on this mountain," she says, "but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship." Jesus says to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father." First thing I want you to see here is that in his hopeful statement, he says something that could easily have been offensive to her. Might have been. I don't know. It certainly could be offensive to many folks even today. But certainly the Jew of his day, this idea that we're coming upon a time when worship will not be centered upon a place. You see, really in church history, or Old Testament history, I should say, the church, it's referred to, God's people even in the Old Testament can be referred to as the church. They're certainly not the New Testament church. But as you look upon the history of the Old Testament, you recognize that what's taking place is always typically centered around a spot. Ever since Moses was given the instructions to build the tabernacle, we've centered upon a spot. And then it becomes the temple under Solomon and beyond that. And even up until the day of Jesus, you've got them centering upon a spot, that mount there in Jerusalem where they came to, and that's the spot. And so everybody believed you had to go to the spot if you wanted to truly be effective in your worship. But that's what Jesus is challenging here, or giving as far as the hopefulness of his statement. He's saying there's a time coming when a spot's not going to be important. In fact, he's going to go on to elaborate the idea that we need to worship in spirit and in truth. And this whole idea that God is spirit references the idea of a lacking in the physical confines of a spot. He's spirit. He's not trapped in spots. You and I are now the temple of the Holy Spirit. And so everywhere you go, you take God with you. And so it's not about going to a spot. It's going to a place of testimony with regards to who Jesus is living within you. The first piece of hope that I see Jesus offering this woman is that you no longer soon. In fact, right now, we're on the verge of this. Because we're not that far off from the time that we're going to have the day of Pentecost, the church is going to begin, etc., and they're going to take the gospel to the entire known world, and people are going to begin worshiping in all kinds of different spots rather than Jerusalem at the temple. Jesus frees her. It's a hope of freedom. He says to the woman, there's a time coming, in fact, we're right on the verge of it, when you will not be trapped by locations. As you converse with your friends on whatever the topic may be, I think it should be relatively easy for you to be able to show your friends how God frees you from the physical entrapments of this life. How that I can be laid up in the hospital. The spot is the hospital bed. Yet I can still look out the window and see that bird as it flies by, or recognize the bud on the tree and know that there is a God, and be taken from this spot into a positive existence. That this physical body does not trap me here. Imagine if you could give that kind of a positive lesson application to your friends. That no matter where you are, God's there. And no matter your circumstances, you can find something positive about it. In my online thing that I do before I show up here each Sunday morning, just this morning I was dealing with Genesis chapter 39, Joseph, as he's thrown into prison by Potiphar. Have you ever thought about Joseph? This is really a kind of an Annie moment, you know? The sun will come up tomorrow. Joseph lives that out. He's sold by his brothers. He's the favored child, so you know he's been pampered, etc., etc., but now he's sold by his brothers into slavery, and so he goes from being the favored child in his home to serving, being a servant in the household of Potiphar. Things look good until the wife catches he catches her eye, and she begins making passes at him, and he refuses all of those things, and you remember the story, how he has to flee, and next thing you find, he's in jail for not doing what she wanted him to do. He just does the right thing and he's in jail. Would you have given up on God at that particular point? Now be honest. You've been sold by your family. You've been placed in Potiphar's house and everything's going really good. In fact, you're over the entire house until the woman looks at you with the wrong intention, and now you're in jail. Were you going to give up on God? It's interesting how that Joseph brings a blessing to wherever he goes. If he's in Potiphar's house is going to do great things. Read the passage. That's what it says. He's transferred from there into prison. Guess what happens? Next thing you know, he's over every prisoner in the entire system, because he is God's man. He's faithful. And I think it could be implied he had the right attitude towards a very difficult situation. The sun will come up tomorrow. And you know the end of the story, how he's going to become second in command, save his family, all that goes on with that. And yet in the midst of it, being sold by his brothers, first of all, they put him in a pit. And he's sitting there while they're eating lunch. Then they drag him up out of there. He thinks, okay, they've been abusive enough. They're going to send me home. No. They sell him to the caravan. He wakes up, he's a slave in Egypt, and he's going to stay in Egypt the rest of his born days. Think about it. Would you have been able to stay with God and been positive? Joseph did. Imagine what we can do if we can take that level of hope into the world and share with people the freedom that we have, because we are spirit beings, not carnal, trapped within the physical body. Second thing that Jesus does is in verse 22 with regards to this idea of hope. he says to her, we're not going to be trapped in a spot. But then verse 22, he says, you worship what you know, but we worship what we know for salvation. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. Second thing that Jesus does with the idea of hope is he points to the source of all hope. A cursory reading of that verse would cause you probably to conclude that the Jew is the source of all hope. That's not really what's being said there. Because Jesus is the Jew of all Jews, right? The entire purpose of the Jewish nation was to bring Jesus to bear. That's what it's all about. And so when Jesus says this, that what's taking place here as far as salvation, it's from the Jew, he's not really pointing back to even Abraham necessarily, as much as he is pointing to himself. Now, Abraham certainly has a significant place, Jacob, all those folks, a significant place as bringing the lineage to bear. But Jesus is who's really being discussed here. The source of all hope is God. Meaning that whenever you have this conversation with whomever it is, it's so very, very important that you source your hope in something bigger than you. You've had this experience as well. People who just feel like that fact becomes fact because they think it. People who presume, they just presume to have the authority by, here's my opinion on that subject matter, and that closes it down because I said it. It has to be the end of the conversation. How arrogant is that? You and I are not the source of hope. Greek word elpis, confident expectation. We are the reflection of the source of hope, but we're not the source. Because let's be frank, you look into your own life, you recognize some of the things that you've been involved in the past, maybe those skeletons in the closets, the things that you're ashamed of, and you don't want others to know, except you got all those, we all do. How could you be the source of hope with all that baggage in your background? You're not the source, but you can be the reflection of the source. And that's what we are called to be. Jesus is the light. We then reflect that light, and by the reflection, we become the light of the world to the world. But we've got to reflect something that's credible, something that's bigger than me. And so Jesus says here, number 2, he says, I need you to see that salvation is of the Jew. It's not of the Samaritan. It's not of this mountain that you think is the mountain you should worship on. It's of the Jew, specifically speaking, it's of me. The one who the entire Jewish process was designed to bring about. Me, the Christ. He's going to go on to say that here in just a moment. That I am the Christ. So the second thing with regards to hope, number 1, Jesus showed hope with regards to the freedom of the Spirit. That I am not trapped by all of the things that go on in this physical realm. I can look above. Number 2, Jesus provides hope as far as its source is concerned. And then number 3, and this one I find to be really big. Verse 23, but the hour is coming, and that is now here, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. See how he did that? Spirit and truth. For the Father, watch it, is seeking such people to worship him. There are 2 things that happen in that verse that are very, very important to our third point. And that is this. Jesus shows the hope of personal responsibility. Unfortunately, we have raised a generation, maybe 2 generations, that don't see a lot of hope in personal responsibility. I was talking to a fellow just recently as I was helping my son do a job, basically cleaning up a lot, hauling off garbage. And he was talking about how it's hard to get anybody to work anymore. Nobody wants to work. And you think about it, our government has made it pretty easy on folks who don't want to work. Just stay home, and you get paid by the government to stay home. So why would you work? And it's presented this mentality in a generation that it's easier not to than it is to. And so they would rather take the easy way out. Many of you sitting in this room, I know many of you worked a lot harder than I have. But I came home the other day, I was just filled with, I got chiggers, I've got poison ivy up and down my arm, etc., because I was crawling around in the dirt trying to collect all the garbage that needed to be taken off that lot, etc. But so many people, they just feel like that's something they can't do. That I'm not doing that. I'm not going to consider that. A little sweat, a little whatever it may be. Personal responsibility is the victim of this. If you think about it, that's the thing that's going to hurt most. It's not that people are drawing a check from the government so that they don't have to work. It's the personal responsibility part of it that we really ought to be concerned about. You wonder why we are such a violent nation? Because nobody takes personal responsibility. I am entitled. And if you're in my way, I'm entitled to that space, so I'll just take you and move you. Even if it means necessarily taking and permanently moving you out of life, I'll do that because I'm me. It's very animalistic. It's celebration. It's the celebration of an animalistic concept of, the more powerful you are, the more rights you have. Survival of the fittest, however you want to put that. But I want you to notice in this verse that Jesus specifically points to the hope of personal responsibility. This is probably too personal, but I'll just say, I had to put in a new toilet in my house yesterday. I had gotten the job almost done. All I was going to do is replace a wax ring. You can get those things at Lowe's for $2.50. It should have been a $2.50 job. It took me all day because after I just about got to the place where I was to install the toilet, I tightened the bolt too much as I'm putting the basin onto the bottom, and I broke the basin. So now I got to go buy me another toilet. So I go and I buy us another toilet, and on and on. I can whine with the best of them, but I got to tell you something. Now this sounds, again, it's probably more than you need to know, but as I looked at my little toilet this morning that I installed yesterday after a lot of sweat, a lot of frustration, a lot of hurt, a lot of pain, I looked at that little toilet and I said to myself, that's pretty neat. You were able to install a new toilet. And forgive me if you think this is wrong, but I thank God for my toilet. You've done that. You mowed the yard and then got you a big sweet tea and sat on the front porch and looked out and said, looks pretty good. This is great. There is just something about doing the job yourself so that after the job is done, you can sit back and say, wow. There's something fulfilling in taking personal responsibility. And it's something that the next generation, many of them are just missing it completely. And so we wonder why so many people are strung out on drugs and they have no hope and everybody's just depressed. It's because they have no personal fulfillment. They haven't taken personal responsibility for anything. Now let's come back to what Jesus says here, because there's two things very powerful. I know I've gone long, but we'll shut down with this. Watch this. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. Did you see that? God is seeking. This is anti-Calvinism. The Calvinists would suggest God does everything, you have no personal responsibility. And by the way, I lay much of the problems we have culturally speaking today in America, I lay it at the feet of Calvinists. They're the ones who have set the bar with regards to a lack of personal responsibility. But I want you to see that God says, I am seeking you. Jesus himself will say, I stand at the door and knock. Why doesn't he just bust the door down? He's God. Because he's seeking us. Jesus will talk about searching for that lost little lamb out in the countryside. Why does he take the time? Because God seeks us. And he seeks us because you and I do have freedom of will. And because of our free will, God recognizes that his love can draw us, but he's not going to force us, as Calvinists would teach us. God seeks us. Now imagine taking that into a conversation with your friend. God is seeking you. God is looking for you. God wants you. Met a man recently on a job with Bryson, and he had been through a lot of hurt. Lost his wife, lost his child, been through a world of hurt. And I looked into his eyes, and I didn't know what else to do. Can I pray with you? And he was thrilled as he took my hand, and we stood there in his front yard and we had a prayer. You know why? Because he realized that I was simply representing, I was the conduit, if you will, of a God who is seeking him, even in the midst of all of his hurt. But it's that second thing that I see here in this verse that's you just don't want to leave this alone. You got to take this one home with you. Notice that the Father is seeking such people to worship him. The damnable doctrine of Calvinism would suggest to you, once saved, always saved. Extrapolate that out. If you're once saved, always saved, you know what that does to your free will? That means that one day when you get into eternity, you will be puppeteered by God because you're once saved, always saved. You have no free will. You have to do what God wants you to do. In other words, God lives in an echo chamber where he puppeteers you to worship him. That's not worship. Read Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercy of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice. Go on and read the next verse, and it tells us that this is our reasonable service or worship to God. You cannot worship without sacrifice. You can't do it. Can you sacrifice something that is not your own? Tell you silly on my dad. We were driving through a parking lot some years ago, and Dad saw a homeless fellow sitting over here. And he said, son, I've got a few extra dollars. I want to give it to that guy. Pull me over there. I was driving. So I pull him over, and as we're about halfway over to this guy, Dad reaches into his wallet to recognize that he had used the $2 on something else. He doesn't have a bit of money on him. He said, son, give that guy some money. Who helped the homeless guy? You can't sacrifice something you don't have. And although my dad's a very beneficial, very generous individual, he didn't sacrifice that day. His son did. To suggest that you and I will one day be forced to worship God throughout eternity is to suggest that you and I cannot worship in eternity. Now hear me, I believe that if you go to heaven that you are going to want to worship. I think it's going to be so overwhelming, the glory of God, that you will want to worship. I don't think there's any doubt that you're going to worship when you get to heaven, but I believe with all of my heart that when you get there, you'll have the choice not to. I do not believe that God is envisioning, hoping that we will be a bunch of robots in heaven, forced to worship him. You will fall on your knees, you will cast your crown because you want to. And in that there is worship. So the third and final thing that I think you should see here with regards to this idea of hope is that there's hope in personal responsibility. And it is your personal responsibility to see God. Two men looked out of prison bars. One saw the mud, the other the stars. Same prison, same outlook on life as far as the potential, but one couldn't get his eyes off of the mud. The other couldn't get his eyes off of the stars. It's all in what you choose to look at. Amen. The sun will come out tomorrow. What are you going to look at? Will you look at the hope and thus show the hope to the world? Or will you look at all the things that are bad and negative, as I very often do, and the person who sees you coming down the aisle in Walmart turns and walks a different direction because I don't want to interact with that guy. He always brings me down. Be a person who, what is this? Number 3, the word is hope. Be like Jesus as he presented hope to this woman who desperately needed it.